For months in 1927, rain soaked the upper Midwest, and the Mississippi's banks quietly rose. Local officials called it regular spring flooding, until cracks in the levees spread into disaster. It became the worst river flood in United States history, drowning whole towns, forcing hundreds of thousands from their homes, and exposing forgotten injustices. But how did one river disaster quietly force America to change forever? The true story begins with a silence everyone chose to ignore. By October 1926, rain began to fall across the upper Midwest, steady and unremarkable at first. Fields in Illinois and Missouri soaked up the water, but the storms kept coming. November brought more, downpours that turned roads to mud and left riverbanks slick and swollen. Farmers noted it in their diaries: another day of rain, land too wet to plow. By December, the ground could take no more. Soil across the Mississippi Basin, from Minnesota to Arkansas, reached near total saturation. Engineers later measured it at over 80% in some Delta counties. Every new storm sent water rushing straight into creeks and rivers, with nowhere left to soak in. In towns along the river, the Mississippi rose quietly but relentlessly. At Cairo, Illinois, the river's gauge climbed day after day, surpassing levels usually seen only in spring. By New Year's Day 1927, the river had already reached flood stage, months ahead of schedule. Still, the rain did not let up. In the Ohio Valley, November through January, totals doubled the seasonal average, dumping over 20 inches in some places. Throughout the lower basin, December alone brought up to 10 inches of rain. Fields that should have been dormant for winter now stood underwater, while levee workers trudged through ankle-deep mud, patching small seeps and cracks that appeared along the embankments. From the riverbanks to the backroads, a sense of unease crept in. The rain had become a constant presence, a low drumbeat that filled the nights and blurred the days. Yet as the water kept rising, most people held on to the hope that this was just another hard season, nothing the river hadn't done before. The Mississippi, though, was already gathering its strength. On New Year's Day 1927, the Cairo, Illinois gauge registered a reading of 12 feet, well above what anyone expected for midwinter. Yet the Mississippi River Commission issued bulletins describing the situation as routine. Their statements reassured the public that these high waters were nothing more than seasonal flooding. In official reports, the phrase "no cause for alarm" appeared again and again, even as the river continued to climb. Engineer John M. Baker, tasked with monitoring the embankments, sent quiet warnings up the chain. He noted persistent seeps and small boils along the levees, signs that the river was pressing harder than ever. But these warnings rarely left the engineering offices. The Commission's leadership, men like Leroy Percy, stood by their confidence in the levees-only approach. They insisted the system would hold, dismissing the record-high gauges as a test the river posed every few years. Community leaders echoed these assurances at town meetings. Newspapers quoted planters and river officials promising that levee patrols and sandbagging crews were more than enough. Meanwhile, the river pressed higher against the earthen walls, watermarks rising above the painted lines of previous floods. Each day, the gap between official confidence and the reality on the ground grew wider. The river's quiet advance was met not with urgency, but with speeches and bulletins, as if words alone could hold back the water. On April 16, 1927, the Mississippi River's defenses finally gave way. The first major breach erupted near Dorena, Missouri, sending a wall of water crashing through farmland and small towns. 5 days later, the river struck again, this time at Mounds Landing, Mississippi. At 8 a.m. on April 21st, a 1,000-foot section of levee collapsed in a roar, unleashing a torrent that scoured the earth to a depth of 30 feet. Within hours, the gap doubled in width, swallowing everything in its path. Water surged into the delta at a rate estimated near 2 million cubic feet per second, faster than anyone could outrun. The flood didn't pause to choose its victims. Entire communities vanished beneath the advancing front. 11 counties disappeared under an inland sea that stretched, in places, over 60 miles wide and 100 miles long. Roads, rail lines, and telegraph wires vanished beneath the muddy water, severing all contact with the outside world. Survivors scrambled for high ground. Some made it to levee tops or the second stories of farmhouses, but for many, rooftops became their only refuge. As the water spread, the Mississippi Delta transformed almost overnight. What had been fields of cotton and corn became a vast, churning lake. The flood advanced so quickly that rescue crews were left behind, unable to reach those stranded by the rising tide. The disaster now covered 700 miles of the river's lower basin, and the magnitude of what had begun was only just becoming clear. Families who survived the first surge of water soon faced a new kind of disaster. Over 630,000 people were forced from their homes, scattered across 7 states with almost nothing but what they could carry. Some clung to rooftops or crowded onto narrow strips of high ground, waiting for rescue that might never come. Red Cross records from May 1927 list entire towns emptied overnight, parents and children separated in the scramble, many never finding each other again. In the makeshift camps that sprang up along the levees, disease spread quickly. Contaminated water and cramped conditions led to outbreaks of typhoid and dysentery. County ledgers from the months after the flood record at least 200 deaths from typhoid alone, but officials quietly admitted the real number was likely much higher. For Black residents of the Delta, the flood brought not only displacement, but brutal injustice. As the water rose near Greenville, white planters and National Guard troops forced thousands of Black men to stay behind and reinforce the levees at gunpoint. WPA oral histories recall men and boys dragged from their homes or stopped on the roads, handed shovels, and told to work or face violence. Over 4,000 were pressed into this labor, some for weeks on end, often without food or pay. When the levees failed anyway, these same men were held back from evacuation, left stranded for days without aid. In the camps, segregation was strictly enforced. Black families were confined to the worst quarters, given the smallest rations, and forced to work unloading relief barges just to receive food. The flood exposed a deep fault line in American society, one where survival depended not only on the river's mercy, but on the color of your skin. At dawn on April 29, 1927, the Caernarvon levee, south of New Orleans, was blown apart with dynamite. Governor Oromel H. Simpson signed off on the order after days of frantic telegrams and backroom meetings with city leaders. The blast sent a wall of water crashing into St. Bernard and Plaquemines parishes, drowning farms and small towns to spare the city's banks and businesses. Promises of compensation never reached those who lost everything. Nearly 18 million acres of farmland vanished underwater, crops rotted in the fields, and the local economy collapsed almost overnight. Banks padlocked their doors, merchants abandoned their stores, and families faced ruin. The damage reached $400 million, an unthinkable sum in 1927. Simpson's decision haunted the region, fueling outrage that would soon spill far beyond the floodplain. When the waters finally began to recede, the South faced an exodus on a scale the country had never seen. More than 200,000 people, many of them Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers, boarded northbound trains or walked away from ruined towns, determined not to return to the fields and levee camps that had held them captive. Census records from 1930 show entire Delta counties losing a quarter of their population in just 3 years. Photographs of families stranded on rooftops and children huddled in muddy camps ran in newspapers from Chicago to Los Angeles, fueling a wave of public anger. The outcry forced Congress to act. In May 1928, the Flood Control Act passed with $300 million in funding, the largest disaster relief package in U.S. history at the time. Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce, emerged as the architect of this new approach, pushing for federal control over the river and promising a system that would never allow such a disaster again. The flood had forced the nation to accept responsibility for its greatest river and set the stage for a new era of government intervention. Today, over 41 million Americans still live in flood zones, and the Mississippi remains a threat. As climate extremes accelerate, history warns that disaster is less about nature than about choices we make. The river's legacy isn't just memory, it's a test we continue to face. What would we do differently?